That's a very famous graph. This question of the relationship between income and happiness is one of the most commonly studied questions in sort of economic psychology and related areas. And it's interesting because you'll hear some people say, well, we've definitively shown that there is no relationship. And other people say, well, the science has definitively shown that there is a relationship. So it can get a little confusing depending on who you're listening to. The first thing you need to do is figure out what you mean by happiness, because it actually makes an enormous difference how you define happiness. So there's one type of study. It's called an experience sampling study. And these are really cool. And the way they work is, people have got their smartphones or they're on them, and you'll get like a text at various parts of the day randomly. You've agreed to be in the study. And every time you get a text, you fill out a very short questionnaire that says, okay, at this exact moment, what were you doing when you got the text? And how did you feel? So it's like, were you driving to work? Were you eating lunch? Whatever it was. And like, how were you actually feeling at that moment? And so it gives a really accurate measure of how people feel through the day, and also like how what you are doing affects how you feel throughout the day. One of the findings from this, for example, is that when people are commuting, they're really unhappy. Like people's scores, when they're commuting are really, really bad. And if you happen to interrupt someone when they're making love, well, their scores there are really good. So, you can find the high points and the low points of people's days this way. But if you look overall and say, okay, how much of the day do people spend feeling good? And then you find out how much money they make, and you just sort it out and say, the people who make a lot of money, do they spend more of their day feeling good than the people who make less money? There's almost no relationship between how much money people make and how they feel. To an extent, that's really surprising to me, because I would have expected that there would have been some relationship, but that it would have been fairly small. But on the other hand, if you're wealthier, you don't have to have a car with a broken muffler, and that noise isn't bothering you, and your air conditioning works and the heat isn't bothering you. And something happens. There's so many people in America where if their car breaks down, they don't have $400 to fix their car, and they're just put into a terrible crisis, right? But if you've got money and your car breaks down, it's not a big a deal. You have it fixed. So it seemed to me like that should show up, but it really does not show up very much at all. There's almost no relationship, unless you get to people who are, homeless and living on the street, or suffering from a severe mental illness or something along these lines. So that's one answer. There's one more really great study on this that I think is very interesting. In this study, they looked at married couples where both members of the couple worked. And they looked at how happy each person was, and they had each person's individual income from their job as well as the combined income as a family. And this was only in families where they pooled all of the money. It wasn't one of these like he keeps his and she keeps hers separately. In this situation, it's really useful because your living standard is based on the joint income, the pooled income, you and your spouse together. How much money you make, that determines like how nice a house you live in and what kind of a car you drive and what restaurants you eat in. But they found that to the extent that people's happiness was related to money, it wasn't related to the combined income. It was only related to their individual income.
Interesting.
So if you have a couple where one person is, making $200,000 a year and the other person's making $20,000 a year, the person making $200,000 a year, if you ask them, how good is your life? They'll report their life is much better than the person earning $20,000, even though both of them are living in the same house off $220,000 a year. And what this means is it's not the consumption. It's not that you get more stuff when you have more money. because the person with the low income has just as much stuff as the person with the high income in that family. Rather, it's your sense of pride that people have this sense of accomplishment that my career is going well and they're proud about that. And so it's really that sense of pride and accomplishment that people get from money. To the extent that money makes them happy, that's really where it's coming from, more than the earning than the spending.
Probably also an underlying theme of ownership and feeling like you have a sense of control in your life, which I'm sure is correlated with the amount of income, even in the joint family. But with your research that you just cited and your own research, I do want to caveat that by asking, were this based out of weird, Western industrialized, educated, rich population?
This research on income and happiness is one of the few research areas where there's huge amounts of data from global surveys. And it's not simply based on Western affluent folks. And you do see differences between cultures. So in some cultures, the correlation between income and happiness is stronger than it is in other cultures. And that has to do with, a lot of different factors. One of the obvious ones is egalitarianism. So if you look at the Scandinavian countries, where there aren't enormous differences between the rich and poor, and there's a lot of government services, the relationship between income and happiness is lower than it is in places where there's a lot of wealth disparity, which is sort of what you would expect. And there are some other differences. But the general finding that if you define happiness as how you actually feel going through your day, you're not going to find almost any effect at all of income on that happiness. But if you define happiness as how successful you feel your life has been, then you will find some relationship between money and happiness, and that sense of feeling successful. That is widely replicated around the world.
That makes sense. Thank you for discovering more with us this week. If you enjoyed watching this video, check out the full-length episode at one of the windows that pops up. And as always, see you again in next week's train of Discover More. Thank you for tuning in.